Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast brought to you by Bangalore International Centre, where we present conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
Now, coming to Pakistan, anytime we were able to go out of Islamabad, it was exciting. I loved the bylanes of Rawalpindi, where one could shop till one dropped and buy material and all kinds of rubbish. I loved Lahore and all the shopping that one could do in Lahore and Karachi. But undoubtedly, I think the one place that I would rate as unforgettable experience was the visit to Mohenjo-daro.
That's very interesting. How about you, Ghanshyam?
In my case, favorite city of mine, I was very fond of a particular sweet, and the origin of that sweet is Karachi. So Karachi is my favorite city because Karachi halwa comes from Karachi. Although in Karachi it is called Bombay halwa.
That's a good one. Now, coming to the question of the shadows who followed both of them around wherever they went. This is the ISS operatives who are put on behind every single Indian diplomat. How oppressive and threatening were they actually? From reading your book, Ruchi, I get the impression that at times they could even be helpful. Like when you got lost, and you didn't know exactly where you were going.
Yes.
And as Ruchi, I think, laughingly remarks in the book, she says, if I have a flat tire, they'll come and help me to change it. So it's a very strange relationship that you had with them because in a way they helped you, in a way they hindered you from making the friends you wanted to make or from visiting the people you wanted to visit. Did that make it a complicated relationship? And how much intimidation did you actually face?
To start with, it was very intimidating because we had a car which was following us everywhere, wherever we went. And there would be two fellows in that. So if both of us were there, it's okay. But sometimes if I was alone, they would try some tricks on the road, aggressive driving, because they felt that being a woman, I would be perhaps more easily intimidated. And on the road, I certainly was intimidated because I didn't like it when they would just drive parallel or just drive as if they are going to touch the bumper, but would hold on at the last moment. So those were difficult experiences. But over a period of time, one could see, okay, this one is on duty and he comes in the morning and he goes in the night and you see the same person coming and going and you lose your way and he comes forward. So I think the fear factor reduces to some extent. But there were incidents like on one occasion, for instance, which I have described in the book, when they followed me into a deserted building after dark, two of them, and that day they were dressed identically in black pants and black leather jackets. And I really felt scared at that point of time. But you're very right. It was to deter us from being too social. As my counterpart, the director India, remarked when I once complained to him, he said, तो फिर आपकी भी तो बहुत सहेलियां हैं, आप भी तो बहुत इधर उधर जाती हैं. So that's the remark that he made about why they were following me so aggressively. So the aim was to keep people away from us, and to an extent they did succeed because those people who didn't have the contacts or the exposure or the depth automatically just stepped back.
That's a pity. And how about you, Ghanshyam? What did you feel?
When I went there and saw this regular trail, first I thought they are doing a job. They have a family to feed and they have a wife and they have children of their own. Maybe they had more than one wife in Pakistan. But so I looked at it from that point of view. It didn't bother me because I had a beard at that time. So I could easily be mistaken to be a Muslim, could be from Karachi, could be from Bangladesh. And I could speak Urdu reasonably well thanks to my training in Arabic. So when I was on my own, except when I was on official work, if I wanted to meet somebody, then they would be more worried about it. If I just went around, they didn't really bother us. But whenever I was with her, then I was important, suddenly. But when she was not there, I was not important.
I'm sure that's not true. You've talked about, of course, your lovely Karachi halwa. But apart from that, I'm very fascinated by the cultures of Lahore and Karachi. What did you see as the ethos of each of those cities?
Lahore is a very, very friendly place.
Yeah.
And people of Lahore, I think there's no better word than Zinda Dil.
Yeah.
They are very lively, very affectionate. And we made some very good friends there. They would take us out, they would take great pride in sharing their city with us. And I was really fascinated by a place called Lakshmi Chowk. I think now the name of that place is changed, but at that time it was still called, and popularly I'm sure even now people would be calling it Lakshmi Chowk. And the food in Lakshmi Chowk was really nice, very, very delicious. Though, of course, they didn't know how to make dal because they put egg or mince meat in almost every vegetarian. They couldn't make vegetarian food. But then in Pakistan, that's not what you want to eat in any case.
Yeah.
So what really fascinated me was a dish they used to call takatak. So on a flat tawa, iron tawa, they would have all the rubbish from the meat, which you will not put in the curries, and the brain, the tongue, the whatever. And they would have like metal spoons with which they would keep hitting it and chopping it, mincing it basically.
So that's the
So
takata.
that was and it was done in a very rhythmic way, very musical way. And I was so fascinated that at one of our dinners, I invited a takatak person to come and do it for our guests. So
that's
that was what I loved about Lahore. Karachi was, Ghanshyam is, it was more his town than mine. I didn't have too much work. But what I liked about Karachi was that women wore saris there. So that was the only place in Pakistan that one could actually buy a sari.
Okay. Interesting. How about you, Gansha? Between Lahore and Karachi?
But both cities have their personalities, I must say. Each one is an organic city by itself. But Karachi had reminiscences of the landlords of Pakistan. So you would find more Baluchi warlords there, and you will find rich people who were well known from Karachi, because Karachi was initially the capital of Pakistan. Islamabad came much later. So it was like Mysore in Karnataka. That was the original state capital. Bangalore came recently. Similarly, that is how Karachi gave way to Islamabad. Islamabad was a much smaller town compared to Karachi, and it was basically the bureaucracy of the government of Pakistan, the parliament and the judiciary and the diplomatic corps and the few people who would service them. That's about it. That was a very small city. It was very easy for people to have surveillance over us because it was not difficult at all. Because hardly any place where you could get lost. Karachi, yes, you could easily get away from the clutches of people who would trail you. But technically, I would say most of them have their own each individual personality. I like Karachi because there were more friends there. I was dealing with business and economics, so more and more businessmen were sitting there. Lahore also there were some, but gradually they also had offices in both cities. So invariably, Karachi was most welcoming to me because Karachi was the city which named me Ghanshyam Mithai Wala. Because I used to give gifts of cashew barfis during Eid and occasions there. And Pakistan is very fond of cashew barfis simply because cashews are not grown there. Every other dry fruit is available in Pakistan and Afghanistan, not cashew. Cashew has to go all the way from down south. Now, because of that, Ghanshyam Mithai Wala name got stuck to me. So Karachi is Karachi. That's, in my opinion.
That's Kaju Katli you're talking
Kaju Katli, yes.
Okay. So, there's a very sweet story of an Indian-Pakistani marriage. Of course, there were many intermarriages across the border because there were Muslim families who were separated by partition, of course. But apart from that, younger people would meet abroad, fall in love, want to get married, and so on. And there's a wonderful story about a friend of Ruchi and Ghanshyam's called Nusrat, and her daughter falls in love with an Indian Hindu boy, and they want to get married. And both families are equally horrified, I have to tell you. And how difficult was it for those kind of bridges to be built and for people to be able to bridge that gap? It must have been very tough.
Yes, indeed. For Muslim families who were divided by partition, it was a different story because they didn't want that after one generation, people shouldn't know their own cousins because they live on two sides of the border. So they, as a matter of practice, they would try to either bring a daughter, niece or someone from India, or boy or a girl. So there were a lot of cross marriages, across the border marriages amongst the Muslim families. But this particular case was a little different because the girl is Muslim, she still is, and the boy is a Hindu and Punjabi Hindu. So his parents were so horrified the first time that I met them. They had all these worries that, she's a Muslim and she'll bring up the children as Muslims, but we are Hindus, and how will people accept, the family, the children? So they had all these worries. But then I realized that the worry is not just from our side, worry is on their side too. Because the girl's father they were both Muhajirs, their families had migrated from India. And they were really horrified. Is the family good? Are they good people? Can they maintain the standards? How will they travel? Will the parents be able to see the daughter? And then all these different kinds of fears about, giving their daughter to an Indian. So it took them a very long time, actually. I had this role of navigating between, because my friend would ask me to please meet them and find out something from them. And so initially, that's what I had to do. Every time I came on bag duty to Delhi, I would try and catch up with them and then convey whatever was asked. But slowly, I think things started to change because the boy also came to Pakistan. He visited them. And I think eventually their love won over the parents on both sides.
Wonderful. You talk about your interaction with tailors, common folk. They sound very heartwarming, actually. Your relationship with your Darzi particularly,
Yes.
I think was very sweet because he used to make things for her especially and send them to her, even when she was back in Delhi and Director Pakistan. So it must have been a very difficult situation for him. You also mentioned the courtesy of Pakistanis. And many of my friends from India who visited Pakistan talk about their overwhelming hospitality, their generosity, their kindness. And is it just a common culture, or why do you think that is?
They were definitely very generous to us, very courteous. They didn't want us to feel as if we were not being treated properly. Some of my Pakistani friends would actually be envious of the treatment that I received at shops, because if I went to a shop with some local person and they would immediately say, chaat mangaye aapke liye, samosa mangaye, like, would you like to have lunch? So my friends would be very upset. We buy from you regularly, but you never offer us anything. Why do you only offer to her? I think partly they didn't want us to feel that we were not welcomed enough in Pakistan. And partly I think the Pakistanis, they didn't want us to go back with this impression that they are not hospitable, or they wanted us to have the best of memory of them.
Wonderful. And you, Ghanshyam, what did you feel?
I think they are basically polite people and humble people and affectionate people. I used to look after trade and commercial work. And then after some time, the High Commissioner gave me the job of commercial visas also. Although I was not happy with it because blue blood foreign service officers do only political work, not visa work and things like that. But anyway, I was given to it. This job was given to me. And I met so many friends during the course of this work. When we left Pakistan, we went to Karachi to say goodbye to our friends. And we had more than 100 invitations. And we had 5 days. They said, breakfast is okay, lunch is okay, dinner is okay, soup is okay. We said, how can you expect us to go to 100 households? It's not possible. Then they said, they made 5 groups of 20 families each. So 5 days, they entertained us. But those 20 families who hosted invited the other 80 families also. So 5 days, it was a huge crowd. That is what I mean by hospitality of Pakistan and the city of Karachi. And for family bonds, which you were asking earlier, I just want to narrate a little story. One day when I was doing this commercial work, a gentleman came into the embassy and asked for me to meet me. So I went and saw him in the visitor's room. Very well-dressed man, very handsome man. And that time I also had a beard. So most people used to think that I could be one of them also. So then he folded both his hands and gave me his card. I looked at the card. It was fold after fold after fold after fold. He was member of practically every government committee, commission, bodies which had been set up by the government of Pakistan. And in addition to that, he was the chairman of at least a dozen companies. The card would never end. So then I looked at the gentleman and said, Janab, what can I do for you? He looks at me and says, Huzur, we are migrants I am from a family which migrated from Gujarat in Surat. And half of us are here and the other half are there. Now there is a wedding in the family. The great-grandchild is getting married and the great-grandmother has issued a fatwa or a diktat that the entire family on both sides of the border should attend this wedding. So I said, okay, very nice. Then how many visas do you need? He said, 500 visas. I said, 500 visa? Because 400 visas is what we used to issue from Pakistan on a daily basis. And on a bad day, it will be 500 or 550. So, but I didn't feel like saying no to him because I asked him, do you expect me to say yes to your question? 500 visas? Again, he folded his hands. Janab, hamari arz hai, hamari request hai, agar aap kar sakte hain. So, I could not say no to him. I ordered for some coffee for him. And then he was sitting and having his tea and reading newspapers. I went across to the visa counselor. Then visa counselor said, who is this gentleman? Are card dekho inki. It seems to never end. He said, आपको लगता है यूजफुल आदमी है? नहीं, कार्ड में तो लगता है यूजफुल है. So I said, but this is not business visa. I am not come to see you for the business visa. This is request from a businessman who wants a visa for attending a wedding. He said, how many? 500 visa. That man also almost fell off his chair. 500 visas. Then he said, Shadi kab hai? When is the wedding? It was 2 months later. Thank God for small mercies because it was not day after tomorrow. Then we sat down and decided that we will make 4 or 5 families into one bundle and there will be all the families and every day we will issue 4 families. Every family will have 4 or 5 people, so 20, 25 people visas were given on a daily basis. After 25 days, we had all the 500 odd people who were ready and the gentleman came and picked up the visa. This is the story of India, Pakistan. There are so many families which are between us on either side of the border. It happens very, very common. And the connection is still there. One day I was coming back from Pakistan for on some courier duty to India. A customs officer comes to me and says, can you bring a Shadi ka joda for my daughter's wedding? You know, the Shadi ka joda has to come from Lucknow when the wedding is taking place. If it is taking place in Karachi, joda has to come from Lucknow. I said, hum Lucknow nahi ja rahe hain. I'm not going to Lucknow. He says, nahi, Khan Market mein ek dukaan hai. This is the name of the shop. This is the number of the telephone of the shop. Wahan jaiega to unke paas hoga. So this is the kind of relationship we have had with that country. So I just wanted to give you this.
I think those are very interesting additions to the story. I know you were both fascinated when you went to Mohenjo-daro. Also Takshashila, I imagine, or Takshila as they call it. Any particular anecdotes from Mohenjo-daro, or was it just the antiquities and the whole Indus Valley civilization that fascinated you?
Going to Mohenjo-daro, I think on the way, it was Benazir's territory.
Yeah.
So it was nice to be pointed, when they pointed out to me, it was really fascinating to see how well organized the whole place was. I mean, they had drains and they had more than one floor and there was this great bath. And to try and imagine that long ago that people could actually plan so well. So I really started wondering, do we really know history at all? We may think that we are, so great, such a big civilization we have become now. But in the past, we don't. What has survived is only what we can see. So that was one thing. And then the guide told us about how the salinity and all that is slowly destroying it and how efforts by the government were either not present or they were harmful rather than helpful. And all that really made me feel very sad. Even worse was the reaction of my Pakistani friends, our Pakistani friends, when we came back to Islamabad. Either people had not heard of Mohenjo-daro, which to me was really like horrifying to think that there is this, we start learning history when we start learning history in school. That's the first thing we read about. The dancing girl. Anybody in India will be able to say something about Mohenjo-daro. But there in that country where it was, people didn't seem to know about it. Those who knew about it knew vaguely, but nobody had ever visited. So that really made me sad.
How about you, Ghanshyam?
I found that, for the first time, I realized that history is not static. It moves. As you read, today's history of a particular territory is not the same as tomorrow's and the day after. The reason is this. When we went to Mohenjo-daro, they told us that the Indus River is flowing at a height of 30 meters above Mohenjo-daro. But in the olden days, the level of Mohenjo-daro went up to 30 floors. So there is no way you can go down to 30 floors. The river has come up so many meters above that ground. So over a period of time, it is destroyed. That is why they say archaeologists, when they excavate new things, your history changes. And today everybody thinks the civilization of Egypt is the oldest or Indus Valley is the oldest. But there are civilizations that have been excavated in Africa which go back to 73,000 years. So that is history today. And it has come because of excavations by archaeologists and experts. So Mohenjo-daro is one place. That is the time I realized that, oh, if it is 30 levels below, how will people know what existed? You can't even go down 30 levels now because the world has grown, the land has come up and the rivers have gone up. So that's a peculiar thing that I noticed in Mohenjo-daro.
Wonderful. You know, we've talked about the nuclear and missile tests, you know, the effect, I mean, it's in your book about what was the effect of India's nuclear tests in Pakistan and how did they react? And of course, they came out with their own nuclear tests immediately after that. And after you've told me from your point of view what happened in Pakistan, I'd like to tell you a little bit about what was happening in Vienna, where I was posted at that time.
So I think the time after India's nuclear tests was probably worse than even the time during Kargil, because the Pakistanis really felt, I think, insecure. They felt that it had to be equalized, that they had to do something to come to the same level and not let India be the one which had nuclear weapons. So there was this big pressure on the government that they should test. You know, somebody reported that one of the journalists, now let me not name her, but at some event where Nawaz Sharif was also there, she was begging him, Mia Saab, kuch to karo, Mia Saab, kuch to. So that was the kind of sentiment which even the common man had. And it was during that time that one of our officers was very badly assaulted. It was just a random assault, and it really made everybody scared. For us, even we found that diplomats were, not hostile, but they didn't want to be seen as being with India. So we were hosting a dinner, and suddenly at the last minute, people started dropping out. And then somebody even asked, are you still going ahead with the dinner? And I was so offended. I said, well, even if nobody comes, we'll have the dinner. So the dinner is definitely going to be held. But it was, in the end, I think we were just left with one or two couples. So that was a very difficult time until Pakistan did its tests.
Yeah.
And then they were so relieved that India had done 5, but they had done 6. So, so then that was their big relief that, okay, now things are equate. Yeah.
Well, I promised to tell you a little bit of what happened with me in Vienna. I was posted in Vienna at the time of the nuclear tests. And believe me, the kind of hostile reception we got from all the countries there, I'm not surprised that people dropped out of your dinner party because every single country raised its voice against us. Yeah. In the Atomic Energy Commission board, which was 30 countries or so. And believe it or not, our only ally after they conducted the test was Pakistan. Yes. Pakistan was the only one who supported us and said, we have a right to test and so on and so forth. It's an interesting twist that while in Pakistan there may have been this rivalry, when it came to a shared attitude, we were the only two who spoke out and said, why shouldn't we conduct? And I remember I was very exasperated and I told the Japanese ambassador was going on and on and on. I told him, I don't understand how a test conducted in India is such a great threat to Japan when the Americans actually bombed your cities. And you don't think that that's a great thing that they've got so many nuclear missiles. And all we've done is conducted test, So this was an interesting side issue. Vajpayee came to Pakistan in 1999. And I want you to tell me a little bit about his visit and how it was received in Pakistan.
It was a very historic visit because this was the time when Prime Minister Vajpayee crossed the border sitting on the bus. You know, people call it the bus diplomacy and all. And he had this array of luminaries who accompanied him. And there was this great excitement in Lahore. We went for the preparatory visit, and people were so hopeful that here we have Mia Saab. You know, he wants good relations with India. He has business interests and he understands the need for good relations with India. And you have, you know, this Vajpayee Saab. And it was a moment of hope. I mean, it seemed as if things could turn around. Of course, we saw later what happened. But it was a good moment. People really received him well. And at the governor's dinner, he spoke extempore. And his speech was so heartwarming. Because he said we can change history, but we cannot change geography. I mean, we cannot change our neighbors. Yeah. We have to learn to live with each other. When the partition happened, it pained us, but we have to, you know, go ahead and move forward. And I think it was about a month or month and a half later, I was coming back to India on courier duty, and we had to come from Islamabad to Lahore, and then there was a wait at Lahore, and then take the flight from Lahore to Delhi. So I went to the VIP lounge. It was a huge, big hall where you could go, and because bag had to be carried by hand, so one had to just stick with the bag. But I saw so many people, every television had people, you know, just watching it and sitting around it. So I was curious, what is it that people are so curiously watching? And then when I went closer, then I realized that they were playing the speech which Prime Minister Vajpayee had given at the governor's house in Lahore, and people were watching it again. So it made a big impact. His visit did make a big impact.
You know, in fact, I'm just looking at the chapter, and the official this is what it says. It says the official banquet in the magnificent Diwani Khas at Lahore Fort was a grand event. Twinkling lights gathered all around in the darkness of the night, creating a festive mood. Soft, melodious music wafted through the air. I suddenly came alive to the music when it started playing the romantic Bollywood song, Baharon Phool Barsao, Mera Mehboob Aaya Hai. Hawaon Ragini Gao, Mera Mehboob Aaya Hai. The dinner spread was lavish by any standards. Both leaders seemed inspired. The tone was set by Vajpayee's quote of a verse of the 11th century poet Masud bin Saad bin Salman, and a Sharif's quote from Vajpayee's poem, Jang Na Hone Denge. You know, so there was this great bonhomie. Yes. But unfortunately, it didn't last for long because this was followed by Kargil. So would you like to speak either on Vajpayee's visit or on Kargil?
There is one little story which is not in the book. When it was decided that Atal Bihari Vajpayee will come to Pakistan, will visit Pakistan, the program had to be made. सब कुछ बन गया है, the one-to-one program that is minute to minute, everything was done. Then what is the core competence of Atal Bihari Vajpayee? He is a mesmerizing speaker. So we must get him to speak in Pakistan. Now, how do we do it? So first of all, you have to get the permission. So an officer who was dealing with Pakistan at that time called Vivek Kadju, when he went with the other team to the Prime Minister's office and said, you have to speak, sir. That is our biggest asset we have, because he can make a difference by speaking, because he's so good, an orator. So agreed. The bolna bhi padega wahan par. That was the response of Atal Bihari Vajpayee. So finally he came. Now, where will he speak? Whom will he address? That was another question. So we were thinking and discussing, and this gentleman, Mr. Vivek Kadju, says, Ghanshyam, there will be a huge security issue if you want to a public meeting. So let us do a small meeting where security is not an issue. So what do we do? I said, which is the most famous place in Lahore? He said, Lahore University of Management Sciences. It's a very fancy place. That's the place where you can address maybe 400-500 people who are invited. He says, that's a good idea. But how do we go across? So then he said, who is the head of Lahore University of Management Sciences? Babar Ali. Babar Ali was a very, very distinguished Pakistani. He was, I think, the head of the World Wildlife Fund. He was a banker and a philanthropist and well-known figure. His son was a friend of mine. So he said, unse mil sakte hain? Of course you can meet him, but kal savere to hum ja rahe hain. Tomorrow morning we are leaving. How can we meet him? So I said, now it is 9 o'clock. I'll ask my friend if it is possible. So puch lo. Then I rang up this friend of mine and asked him, is it possible for us to meet Babar Ali today? Then his son said, give me 5 minutes, I'll let you know. 5 minutes back, he came back. He is ready to see you. So both of us, Mr. Kadju and me, went across Lahore. It was not very far from the hotel, and we went to Babar Ali's house. And Babar Ali was a very distinguished looking man, tall, handsome, flowing white hair. And we went there. The lights were switched on when we actually went inside. And then just about getting inside. Then after 2-3 minutes, we saw the gentleman, Babar Ali, walking down in his nightgown. Came down and sat with us. By the time green tea, biscuits, everything had been served, then he asked, what should we do for you? Then we put forward this proposal that Atal Bihari Vajpayee should address a gathering of invitees in LUMS, Lahore University of Management Sciences. He just looked at us for a while and said, let me consult the government and tell you. And then it was communicated to government of Islamabad, government of Pakistan. They must have in their wisdom, including Nawaz Sharif, decided that yes, Vajpayee should be made to speak. But where? Lahore Fort, because it's covered from all sides. You have only one gate through which you can go and one gate through which you can come out. That is how this fort address was decided. So this is the story behind it, which is not in the book.
Interesting story. And now we come to Kargil. After the promise of Vajpayee's visit, unfortunately, Kargil happened. And I'd like to have your view, Ruchi, first on how did this come about and what was the reaction in Pakistan?
Many people believe that even when Vajpayee and Nawaz Sharif were meeting in Lahore, the planning for Kargil was already going on. Now, of course, the truth we may never know. The two sides blamed each other. The military said that Nawaz Sharif was briefed, and Nawaz Sharif said that his side said that he was not briefed. I mean, not the individuals, but their spokespersons in the media, informal sources, etc. So one really doesn't know exactly when Nawaz Sharif came to know about the planning for Kargil. But it's definitely true that at some point of time he would have been briefed. He may not have been briefed in detail, may not have been briefed fully, but at some point of time he would have been briefed. And there are some who say that perhaps he thought that if Pakistan army succeeded in Kargil, then Pakistan's negotiations with India would become easier because they would have an upper hand on the ground, and that would, abaya oont pahad ke niche, as they say in Hindi, they would manage to put India in a weak position and finally maybe get the concessions that they were looking for. This is one view which people gave, that maybe that's the reason why, even while knowing about it, Nawaz Sharif may have gone ahead with it. Now, which version of this is true? Nobody can say. Certainly, I cannot say because I am not privy to it. But what I can say without any doubt is that whatever was done in Lahore was lost in Kargil.
That's a good way of putting it. You had a military coup after this when Musharraf took power and deposed Nawaz Sharif. So how did that come about?
So when Pakistan had the debacle that it did in Kargil, eventually they had to withdraw and the bodies were not acknowledged, and it was a rather unceremonious defeat that they suffered in Kargil. Despite having massive advantages to start with, our military advisor, I remember at the start of Kargil, explained to me that in military parlance, they say that if you are occupying the heights, you don't even have to use your guns. You just have to roll down rocks, and that would be enough to kill the opposing side, which is trying to reconquer the height. So they had this massive advantage, but they obviously didn't plan. Benazir Bhutto is later on quoted as having said that a similar plan had been put forward to her by Musharraf, but she turned it down because there was no way forward. If they win the Kargil Heights or they occupy the Kargil Heights, what next? Is it a way to Delhi or is it a way to Srinagar? What exactly was it that they were aiming for? So that was not clear to her and she turned it down. Once this debacle happened, the military obviously was trying to project that we didn't really lose the battle. We had, this massive Indian army on edge. We kept them at bay for so long. A few soldiers and few mujahideen from our side. They kept these people. So we had won the battle, and these politicians, they went and lost it in the negotiations. So they were trying to project it in that way. Whereas, of course, the political side was trying to say what was this foolish venture that they did, and we were left with no way but to go and try to retrieve the situation. And that Prime Minister went to talk to President Clinton and find a way out with the consent and knowledge of the Chief of Army Staff. So this debate was building up in the media. And it was very obvious that between the two, one has to go. Obvious thing seemed, of course, in India, we would probably think that the chief has to go because, if the military people have made the mistake, then the chief has to go. But in Pakistan, it doesn't work that way. It works differently. So people were anticipating that there would be a coup. And during that time, we had gone to a former army chief's house for dinner. And the driver who took us went to a chai shop nearby, where other soldiers were also there. And when he came back, he was talking about how everybody was talking of Mia Saab has to go, Nawaz Sharif has to go. And the media was filled with stories of corruption and mismanagement and misgovernance and this and that. So it was all building up. So it was not a question of whether it would happen. It was just a question of when it would happen and how it would happen. So it was, the build-up was very clear. It was even to us, it was obvious that a coup will happen.
It did happen. Okay. Well, now we come to the part that you've all been waiting for. The hijacking of Indian Airlines flight IC 814. It was hijacked, if I can just give a little background to this, by the Harkat ul Mujahideen group. There were 5 terrorists involved in the hijacking, and the flight took a very tortuous route to Amritsar and then to Lahore, and then was it Dubai? Dubai, and finally to Kandahar in Afghanistan. And that's where our hero comes in. And unfortunately, there was the stabbing of Rupin Katyal at that time. And my question to Ghanshyam is, why were you specifically selected, Ghanshyam?
When this actual event happened, it was Christmas Eve. Most of the officers normally tend to go home or take leave at that time. That is what happened in Islamabad also. And the deputy chief of mission, who should have been the one who should have been sent at that time, he was not available. He was on leave. And somebody must have decided in Delhi. So they had to identify an officer who was not too senior to become conspicuous, like the High Commissioner himself. The High Commissioner himself would have possibly wanted to go, but then he was an ex-army officer, and he was smart, he was good, and he would have possibly done a better job than I did. But government wanted him to sit in Islamabad and manage the situation. And there was nobody else. The next person was Ruchi. You can't send a lady to the Taliban land. So the number came to me. That is how I got sent across. And often people ask me, weren't you scared? Weren't you worried that something will go wrong? Something may happen which might affect your career, your life, whatever. I said, look, whatever has to happen will happen. So best thing is to go with a blank mind. That is how I was trained. Even when I went to attend my examinations in school and college, I used to be blank before the exam. And people used to talk about questions and answers among themselves. I used to get petrified. So I said, keep away from these fellows. I would go away and then just... But when I sat on the exam paper, then I started answering questions one by one. Normally, I would start with first question, answer, then go to the second question. Sometimes it got me into serious trouble. One exam, they said, answer any 4 out of 5. I answered all the 5 and got 111 out of 100. So the head of the department had to howl me up. So that's the story of Kandahar.
That's hardly the full story. You went on a UN plane to Kandahar,
Correct.
right?
That's right.
And when did the team of Sahai, Anand Arni, Doval, Sandhu, and Vivek Katti
They came
arrive?
late in the night on the same day.
On the same day. Okay, so at least you did have
Yeah, I had
some
about 8 hours of time in which I had to be on my own.
on your own.
On my own.
Yes.
So
And that
So
was a bit tense from what I
that
see.
was because there was nobody I could speak to. I had a satellite phone, and that satellite phone was an open phone. You know, it could easily be monitored by the ISI. And so when I started informing the High Commissioner, this is what it is. So there is a camp in which there are doctors and nurses in case if something goes wrong in the aircraft, and then the doctors are required. They have made the arrangement. Then there is one place where there is food that has been stored, grains and all that, not actual food. So all these things I was trying to explain to him. And that was the period of Ramadan. And I had eaten 2 toasts and maybe a boiled egg or something in the morning. And this was 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock, and there was nothing to eat there because those people at that time were not eating because it was fasting time. Then there was a young chap who was working for the United Nations Office on Coordination of Humanitarian Assistance, Cha. So he was an Australian with an Indian wife. So poor fellow took pity on me and gave me quietly a big packet. It's a small packet of some stuff. And then he said, this will come in handy for you. When I opened it in my room, they were full of chocolates. I've never eaten so many chocolates at that one point in time. So because I was hungry also. The situation was that you had no choice. After some time, the High Commissioner says, don't give me call. Don't call me anymore. Because
Calls were being monitored.
calls are, he didn't say that. I understood it and he understood it that I should not call him. So then I was on my own. And about a few months ago, the Taliban had hacked to death using swords a dozen journalists from Iran. So they could do anything. So they could do the same thing to you also. But then somehow I had this feeling that the Pathans are people who are polite and people who are friendly and people who are affectionate. So that feeling was always there because you are not in Pakistan, you are in Afghanistan. So that was an additional benefit for me because the people were nice. Like the moment I went there, the 2 people who were waiting to receive me were the foreign minister and the head of the United Nations assistant. The first thing they ask you is, are you all right? How was the flight? And nobody asks you those questions. It was a place where you were welcomed for whatever work you were coming to. The enemy was inside the aircraft, sitting in the aircraft. But the rest of them who possibly were hand in glove with the enemy, but pretended as if they were with us in the beginning. And possibly they did till the end. Finally, when the resolution took place, they had a part to play too.
I know that they started off with a ridiculous list of demands. They wanted 36 prisoners to be released from Indian custody. They wanted the remains of Sajid Afghani to brought back to Afghanistan and buried there. And they wanted $200 million. And I think with skillful negotiations, they managed to drop the second and the third demand. And finally, they settled on 3 names of people to be repatriated. That was Masood Azhar, Ahmed Omar Saeed Sheikh, and Mushtaq Ahmed Zargar. And the negotiations went on from 27th till the 31st. So it took that long to sort of hammer down the demands. And then what happened?
Well, once the decision was taken that the government of India had given a clear-cut objective to the negotiators. They said, we want the passengers, number 1. We want the crew, number 2. And we want the aircraft back, number 3. This is your objective and you go and come back. And there was no time there was not even telephonic connection between this team except through satellite phones, which would be monitored by anybody there at that time. So we had to work with that objective. And then these 3 objectives had to be compared with the 38 demands which came from the other side. So many times the negotiations would go up and go down. Sometimes it would come back because we started by saying, okay, what is the problem with children? Let them come out. Release the children. That is first. They agreed. They say, what will the children do? Let their mothers also come. So, okay, then the mothers also will come. Then we'll say, what about these old people, 65, senior citizens, very senior citizens? They are of no use to you. So we release them. So they would come back. Then comes able-bodied men, the rest of them. Or we'll say they would disagree at that time. Then we'll again come back to square. This kind of a thing happened half a dozen times. And we had to accept and we had to keep on prodding. And the hard job was done by Ajit Doval, who is the National Security Advisor now. And the rest of us used to motivate ourselves and motivate him and strategize among ourselves. All that used to happen. Anand Dharni, he was another person, because when we all ganged up in Afghanistan, Pakistani newspapers started writing, these negotiators are speaking a coded language, because the coded language was actually Kannada. Because Anand Arni, because there were 6 people who went for the negotiation. First 2 were from the R&AW. They were both, one was hardcore Kannada speaking himself, and the other one was an IPS officer of Karnataka cadre. He was a North Indian, but he had learned Kannada because he was working for the state cadre in the IPS. And I was the third one. So we were speaking in Kannada. The Pakistani newspapers are writing, they are speaking in a coded language, which we are not able to understand. That's an aside. But the fact is, by the time everything was over, we really had a great sigh of relief, because it was, we didn't know every day how long it will go on, when will it end. We had no clue whatsoever. And even when it was towards the fag end, we were thinking that we should go on till the last 3, let the 3 demands become 1. In fact, there was a gentleman who was inside the aircraft called Roberto Giori, and he had a holiday with someone who had a companion called Christina. Christina was the name. And he, after coming out of the aircraft and coming to Delhi, somebody asked him. So he was telling that the most fearful and most petrifying experience inside the aircraft was 3 hours after the aircraft took off, when they did not allow, Pakistanis did not allow the aircraft to land in Lahore. Because Lahore, they switched off the runway, and the pilot was almost in panic because he had no fuel on board. There was no way he could have gone off. Finally, I think he managed to come back to this place, Amritsar, because first he went to Lahore because he was not allowed to land. Then he came to Amritsar. Then Amritsar also didn't load. Then he went to Pakistan again, Lahore again. So the last time they said he had fuel for less than 30 seconds when he actually touched the ground. That was, so this is what this Roberto Giori says, that we could have been finished at that time only. Unfortunately, we survived. And the next thing he says, that inside the aircraft, there was music which was coming up. All this is not in the book, what I'm trying to tell you. Music was all about Islamic music, and then there were lectures given to them on how petrifying experiences of innocent people in Jammu and Kashmir, subjected to the brutality of the Indian army, blah, blah, blah. And then there was no tea, there was no coffee. You remember what happens to a toilet if in an aircraft, 8 days if passengers are sitting inside and they are not going out. The whole place stinks, including the air, the entire aircraft. They had to sit like that, stinking toilet, 6 of them in the whole aircraft. So then he says, these people are ready to kill and are ready to be killed. There is no way you can finish negotiations with them. You have to give what they want. And if they had not, he writes, this fellow says, he's given a statement to the Time magazine in which he says, had government of India not released Masood Azhar, they would have taken off this aircraft with the passengers and gone and crashed it in the mountains of around Kandahar and made sure that everybody, including them, got killed. That is the statement coming out of this Roberto Giori. And who is this Roberto Giori? To save him, the government of Switzerland sent a special envoy with 2 assistants to Kandahar and then on to Delhi to persuade the government of Delhi to finish the negotiation quickly. This man, Roberto Giori, is the owner of a company which manages 90% of the entire currency printing business of the world. That is Roberto Giori for you.
Finally, on the 31st of December, Jaswant Singh came in person on the same plane as the 3 who were released, these 3 whom they had demanded. And, I think in many quarters it was sort of criticized because they felt that the foreign minister of India should not have escorted these terrorists and should not have come with them. It was something which perhaps he should not have done. So what's your feeling about that?
First, at that time, there was a lot of panic in Delhi because there was so much pressure on the government, so much pressure on the Prime Minister from the families of all these people who were on board on the aircraft. So there was enormous amount of pressure. And then there was once a complaint saying that how come Ghanshyam is not giving information to MEA? The other 2 fellows are getting information. So I was wondering what is wrong with this. because every time I tried to speak to the foreign secretary, he would not pick up the phone because the mobile phones were new at that time. He had not switched it on. So obviously he will never hear what I'm saying. He will never hear the call. So it took some time for people to explain to him that you have to do this, that. Finally. So this decision of the government to take 3 dreaded terrorists in an aircraft and just the foreign minister going along with, I later on did a lot of research to understand why it happened and what was the reason behind it. And this was, I didn't know at that time when I was in Kandahar. When I was writing this chapter, at that time I started working on, I came to know that in one of the cabinet meetings, Atal Bihari Vajpayee was the prime minister. He had all the other ministers, including some agencies like IB, MEA, External Affairs. Everybody was sitting there. And Jaswant Singh raised his hand in that meeting and said, Mr. Prime Minister, is it not a good idea for someone from among us to go there to the spot and not leave everything to the bureaucrats? Something to that effect. And then the Prime Minister said, you want to go? That's how he came.
I'm still not convinced that it was the right thing for the foreign minister to have done.
Yes, I agree, because he could have come in a separate aircraft. Although there was scope for him to come in, it's not a long distance or anything, it's just across the border. So he could have taken a smaller plane for himself and brought this terrorists in, because that was another big jumbo aircraft. The problem is Air Force was not possibly consulted. It was Indian Airlines versus Government of India. They already had 2 aircrafts there. This was the 3rd one that was going. Right. So things must have taken place. Everything at that time was all how to get the passengers out and get them out of Kandahar and bring them to Delhi. The entire concentration was that. Nobody bothered about everything else.
Well, just to complete the story, Masood Azhar went on to attack the Indian Parliament. Syed Sheikh was involved with Al-Qaeda and Taliban, and he killed Daniel Pearl and was eventually sentenced to death. And Zargar kidnapped Rubia Saeed, the wife of the then Home Minister, and there were 36 murder cases against him. So we paid a very heavy price for releasing these 3 people. But again, it was a question of innocent life.
You have been listening to BIC Talks by Bangalore International Centre. If you liked what you heard, do follow us on social media. Keep up with our programming by signing up for our mailer on the website, or leave us a review on Apple Podcast or iTunes. The crew that makes these podcasts possible is S. Sarvana Raj and Ranjit Kumar on sound supervision and production. Artwork is designed by Chandani Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studio. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org. This is Sunaina Jain signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.